Hi folks, welcome back to Organizational Illusions. This is the second installment of our Let's Talk series, and in this segment we're going to talk about equity. In the first segment we talked about diversity, and just as a reminder of where we were, one of the last things we said in the first segment is if diversity creates conflict, and inclusion creates cooperation, then equity has to be the bridge between the two. So, if we accept that premise, then we have to ask ourselves, what is equity? Well, when it's broken down, equity is a really simple concept. It's fairness. Fairness in the workplace, fairness in the treatment of everyone in the workplace, no matter what they look like, nor what cultural framework they're drawing off of. So equity really is getting at the essence of what we will talk about as inclusive workspaces. One of the things that we know is that equity is essential for laying the groundwork for that bridge between diversity and inclusion. So if that's the case, what does equity look like? Well, when I'm asked this question, what does equity look like, one of the things that I think about is the 3 P's of equity. You might ask yourself, well, I've never heard of the 3 P's of equity, Troy. What are the 3 P's of equity? The 3 P's of equity are pay, promotion, and protection. So the first one is almost self-explanatory. When someone starts talking about equity in the workspace, what we generally focus in on is equity in pay. Am I being paid the same amount as another person that is doing the same job in the same workspace? And a real easy way to look at the disparity between groups within the workspace and their pay structure is to compare women with white men in the workforce. The reason that we use white men in the workforce is because white men are representative on average as the highest paid worker doing whatever position they are doing within the workspace. So if a white male is making 100% of the maximum wage, then if we want to understand equity in reference to pay, all we have to do is compare them to the other women that are doing similar jobs. So Asian women tend to make about 87 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. White women make about 79% or 79 cents for every dollar that a white male makes. Black women make about 63 cents for every dollar that a white male makes, and Hispanic women make about 54 cents for every dollar that a white male makes for doing the same job. You can imagine that if people within the workspace understand that one person is getting paid more than another person for doing the same work, it's going to create some conflict. So if organizations want to remove this conflict from the workspace, then one of the ways to do it is to focus in on pay and start paying individuals that do the same job more equal rates of pay. The second P is promotion. And it doesn't take too much looking around to see who gets promoted and who doesn't get promoted. And if you're working hard and you're not getting promoted, then you're going to start asking why that is. And this is another contentious issue that plays itself out in the workspace. Drawing off of the Business Insider, we can look at these disparities and how they work out in the corporate world. So, when we look at entry-level positions in the corporate world, we find that 17% of entry-level positions are occupied by women of color. 31% of these positions are occupied by white women, 16% of these positions are occupied by men of color, and 36% of these positions are occupied by white men. When we go up one level, and that level takes us up to the management level, we see that women of color start to lose some position. They now occupy 11%. White women, too, lose some position. They occupy 26% of the managerial positions. Men of color hold their own and occupy 16% of these positions, and white men start to stretch it out at 47% of these positions. We move up to the next level of senior management and directors. Once again, women of color lose position. They now occupy 8% of these positions. White women hold their own and they occupy 26% of these positions. Men of color lose some position and they occupy 13%, and white men continue to stretch it out at 54%. We move one more level up to vice president. Once again, women of color lose ground. They now occupy 4% of vice president's positions. White women, 23%. Men of color, 11%. And white men, 61%. Go one more level up, senior vice president. Once again, black women, or women of color, occupy 4%. White women, 18%. Men of color, 19%. And white men, 70%. And finally, the C-suite, or the highest level of the corporate hierarchy, women of color occupy 3%, white women 18%, men of color 12%, and white men 67%. So if we are trying to create equitable, fair workspaces, then we're going to have to start promoting based on merit and not what one looks like. And what that means is that if you want this conflict to dissipate within the workspace, then it's going to have to be visible for those working in that space to see that if they work hard, then they'll be promoted. So the second place where we reduce conflict in the workspace is going to be in reference to promotion. And the last place that we really need to focus on, and this is a place where we haven't necessarily thought about in reference to equity until recently, is protection. When we think about the legislation passed in the 1960s in reference to equal pay and the anti-discrimination legislation that was passed in the Civil Rights Act and of course the Americans for Disabilities Act, what we're really talking about is how do we protect people in the workspace from being discriminated against. But recently, in the last couple of years, this idea of security has taken a new form. And in the last couple of years, we've seen the rise of the Me Too movement. And what this movement is saying is that women don't feel safe in their workspaces. And they haven't felt safe in their workspaces for a long time. And I would imagine people of color don't feel safe in their workspaces either. And they haven't felt safe in their workspaces for a long time. But we see this in reference right now to the rise of the Me Too movement. Women have consistently said that they don't feel as if they've had the opportunity to speak about this failure to provide a safe workspace for them, nor have they felt that their voices would be heard and anything would be done about this unsafe workspace if they were to take it to the next level within the workspace, whether they would take it to their manager or whether they would take it to an HR representative. They just don't feel like anything would be done. This has prevented women from reporting issues of harassment, assault, and even rape within the workspace. But we're seeing a real sea change in reference to how women are reporting these instances of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape today. So if companies cannot create a secure and safe space for employees to carry out the company's purpose and mission, then ultimately equity is going to be sacrificed. And you're not going to move from diversity to inclusion. So the three places that companies really need to focus their efforts in reference to equity is pay, promotion, and protection. If companies can create equitable workspaces based on these three issues, then they're more likely to move from what we at Organizational Illusions are calling conflict to cooperation. And by doing so, they're going to create inclusive workspaces based on equity and fairness that rest on the foundations of both diversity and equity. And if we can rest on the foundations of diversity and equity, then we can take that next step, which is inclusion.